is up, dads? It's Mike here with my good friend, co-host, and all-around right-wing Chad, Dave Martel. And we are doing Culture Dads. So, yeah, we'll just get right into it. So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to do a deep dive into tabletop RPGs. This is something that Dave is very passionate about, knows a lot about. He's pretty much like, you couldn't find a better subject matter expert on this particular subject in our sphere. So this is it, man. If you want to know about tabletop RPGs, this is the podcast to be listening to. So without further ado, Dave, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. My voice is a little blown out. I got back from Folkish Summer Hollowing on Sunday evening and had a wonderful time with the community, but yeah, still a little sore. My voice is struggling a little bit, but it was a
lot of hooting and hollering, doing those bloats and everything.
Yep, hooting and hollering and hailing, campfires, good conversation, awesome. Smoking like a chimney, drinking mead. It was a good time.
Nice. Man, I'm jealous. I wish I could have been there for it. Maybe next year.
Next year.
Yeah, man. No, I'm really excited about this topic. It's something that I am not all that familiar with. I'll let you take it away. You do the background, the introduction, and then
sure.
I'll give my sort of like my own personal background with tabletop RPGs.
Okay, so the tabletop RPG meaning role-playing game, isn't, when we think about that, we usually think of a bunch of nerds sitting around a table, one guy with a dungeon master screen and like a bunch of weird shaped dice and stuff like that. And we kind of consider it to be purely a pop culture invention, a modern pop culture invention. But the fact of the matter is games like this have existed for since the ancient times. And if you want to go back and listen to our episode about the video game RPGs, I do a pretty big deep dive into the history of the RPG there, but we're going to do a little bit of a brief overview anyways. So if you go all the way back to the ancient times, dice games, strategy games have always been with our people, as well as not just these dice and strategy games, but injecting kind of cultural and historical elements and themes to them. For example, chess. It has a rook, it has a knight, it has a queen, it has European cultural elements to it. If you go back even further, there are the predecessor to that is called Tafel, which was invented by the Norse, it was invented by the ancient Germanics, and then all over the ancient world, all over antiquity, were dice and strategy games. The Romans had a game called Tabula. They had a game called like Tessera. The Romans were crazy with these kinds of games. They had so many different little board games and dice games, and they were all into it. The Greeks had quite a few, but this is something interesting. There has been found archaeological evidence. The Romans actually had a game. We're unsure what the game was, but they had a game where they had a 20-sided dice, a dodecahedron dice. So we have found literal D20s from ancient Rome. This is how far back this stuff goes.
That's awesome.
Is that cool? So
that's trad.
Hell yeah, big time. So we go forward a little bit. Probably in around the late Middle Ages, going up to the 1800s, developed kind of what we would understand to be wargaming. Little toy soldiers being moved around the table, sort of like advanced chess, right? This was kind of like the original versions of tabletop wargaming, which was created by guys that were in wars, soldiers and generals or whoever, and they liked the game of war, the strategy of war, but after the war was over, they developed these little games to play with their buddies. So in 1913, the first ever codified version of rules for this type of gaming was called Little Wars, and it was actually written by H.G. Wells. A lot of folks will be familiar with that name. So tabletop wargaming became a thing, and it was actually sort of popular hobby for bros and chads and dads and the like would really get into this wargaming stuff. So a more advanced version, there's a bunch of little game companies that were out around that time that were from the early 1900s going into the later 1900s. There were quite a few different game companies that were putting out different rule sets and little miniatures. And it's also, this is something that they do today with like the Warhammer 40K. Part of the fun of this is painting them or sculpting them or putting them together. It's like this model building plus it's like this artistic thing plus strategy plus it's like everything that it's like everything that is the masculine brain in a hobby. You know what I mean? So this is going on, and there's a company called Gygax Games, which is out around in the 60s. And Gygax Games produced a game which was written by a guy named Gary Gygax. It was called Chainmail in 1970. And in 1970, they came out with a supplement for it that was written by a guy named Dave Arneson and then also Gary Gygax. And this was called the Fantasy Supplement. And this was really the first time that wargaming was taken from modern times and then given a fantasy medieval flair. Obviously, around this time, there was tons of other like more modern versions of board games. One of the biggest ones was actually called Tactics 2, which came out in 1952. So this was something that was actually pretty popular around that time. It wasn't just like a nerd culture thing or whatever. It was people who just played this. This was a legitimate pastime for people. So with this, they created the fantasy supplement for Chainmail for Gygax Games. Later on, this evolved into a full-on game, which we now understand to be Dungeons and Dragons, which came out in 1974. And they gave this idea of Dungeons and Dragons, which was the first role-playing game. And what made role-playing different than wargaming was you play, instead of having an entire army, you controlled one character on the board. You had one piece on the board. So they proposed this to Gygax Games, and Gygax Games was like, this is ridiculous. You guys, this is going to be a big waste of money. Nobody's going to ever want this. So Gary Gygax, being the purist and guy that was like in love with his vision, he said, okay, screw you. Me and Dave and a couple of my buddies are going to go over and start a new company called Tactical Studies Rules, which is called TSR. Some folks will be familiar with that. In 1974, they came out with the box set for Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons, it was the original box set was kind of pretty primordial and a little bit archaic compared to what we would later understand to be D&D to be, but it was completely revolutionary, and it sold a lot of copies. It sold a lot of boxes. It made them fairly wealthy, right? So they went on and they created other editions and so on and so forth. But these games were very much influenced by history. Gary Gygax, who was a very brilliant man, he created this game, obviously based on his extensive knowledge of history. He based it on a lot of his favorite. He was a big Pulp Fiction fan, so he was very influenced by Jack Vance's Dying Earth, Conan, Robert E. Howard's Conan series, a lot of these kinds of books, and he actually lists them in part of in the appendix N of the Dungeon Master's Guide, I believe, from the 80s. But yeah, so he creates this game called Dungeons and Dragons, and it kind of just takes the world by storm. And then there's so many copycats that come out after that, and a lot of people don't realize is that the concepts that were in this Dungeons and Dragons went on to become the mechanics for all gaming, period. Things like XP, hit points, stats, attributes, gaining different things while you level up. Pretty much everything that is we associate now with gaming, period, was invented by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. You can't even play Call of Duty or Need for Speed Underground or whatever. You can't even play Madden without Gary Gygax's influence on it. So yeah, and he started probably the biggest gaming convention in the world, which is called Gen Con, which is completely paused now. But Gary Gygax started that whole thing in 1969. So this guy, Gary Gygax, is probably the most influential pop culture, one of the most influential pop culture figures of our time. He really went on to influence so much. And unfortunately, what happened was later on, as TSR kind of went up and down and up and down, they produced a lot of really cool stuff, a lot of cool supplements, a lot of cool settings, campaign settings for his adventures, and like all kind of stuff. Unfortunately, what happened was there was some changing of hands among the board. Gary Gygax wasn't in full control of the company. they brought in this woman from Hollywood named I believe her name was Lorraine Williams, and she was just a complete scumbag. She went behind Gary Gygax's back and made a deal with some of the other shareholders, and then bought him out and completely like started changing the company against his will, the company that he created. And he's like, all right, screw this, I'm out. And he went on to do other great things, right? He went on to help do movies, and he was just Gary Gygax was the man. And really, I'll be honest with you, what kicked TSR it up through the roof was kind of the moral panic of the 80s. The moral panic of the 80s, where there was like one lady, I can't remember her name. Her name was Paula something or other. She created what was called what was it called? Bad. It was like something I can't remember what it was called. It was something that was like or CAD, or it was like Concerned About Dungeons and Dragons is what the organization was called. And they pretty much brought Gary Gygax onto these like kangaroo court trials and questioned him, and it was like really, really crazy. Which, by the way, Gary Gygax was a conservative, right-wing, religious guy. He was not some sort of leftoid, satanic, like subversive guy. He was a guy that loved tradition. He was very deeply religious. He was involved with militias back then, right? They actually, I read, I don't know how true it is, but I read that he actually got raided and had like this huge stash of guns because he was like involved with the militia movement at the time. I don't know how true
Supposedly
that is.
He was like an avid hunter and gun guy. I've learned this too. So yeah.
Yeah, so he wasn't all the way our guy, but he was definitely on our side of things.
Yeah,
right?
and you can like his like love for tradition and like traditional European myth and legend and conservatism and all that. I mean, that shows through in just the overall shape of the world that like Dungeons and Dragons inhabits, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, long story short, that was Dungeons and Dragons. After that, the tabletop gaming concept exploded. You get Games Workshop, which actually started out as creating D&D supplements called White Dwarf. They created a magazine called White Dwarf, and that's how Games Workshop started. Now they do Warhammer 40K. They do all kinds of other stuff. You have obviously you have games like Pathfinder, Palladium, Cyberpunk. It went in so many different directions with wargaming and role playing and like all this kind of stuff to create this, this kind of pop culture phenomenon that we now all associate with D&D. It doesn't matter who you are. You can go into the hood and ask some rando black guy, like, yo, do you know what D&D is? He's going to know what it is. He's going to at least understand the concept.
We're going to talk about black guys in D&D in a little bit.
Oh, yeah, let's do it. So yeah, that's my overview.
Okay, good. Yeah. The reason I say that, I didn't have much to say about like, black people with, Dungeons and Dragons, but I did watch this video actually of a guy who is like an avid D&D guy. He's a black guy, and he's talking about like, why do black people not like it? Like, why is it just not for them or whatever? And, I was all expecting, I was geared up to like, hearing about like, Eurocentrism and racism in it and like, blah, 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 all this bullshit. Actually, he had a pretty good take. It was nothing revolutionary, but he was just basically like, look, black culture doesn't want it. You're thought of as like a burnt cracker if you're I think that was the term that was used. If you're into this stuff, it's like why y'all being a white boy, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, he also was like, and black culture is very religious, and there's the religious side to it as well. And I know we're gonna dive deep into that too, the religious objections to Dungeons and Dragons. But just a couple of things I wanted to kind of like touch on here in my sort of like, you're the expert. Dave's the expert here. I'm just the grug that's along for the ride. But I do have a little bit of experience with Dungeons and Dragons and a little bit of experience with Magic the Gathering. I just want to pose this question to you, Dave, right off the bat.
Yeah.
Because hopefully the answer is yes. Otherwise, like half my prep's not going to matter. Do you consider Magic the Gathering to be a kind of tabletop RPG or like adjacent to it?
It's certainly adjacent. Yeah, obviously it's a card game. It's going to be something a little bit different. But as far as a game, and there's lots of, at least there was quite a few copies of not copies, but inspired kind of card games like Magic the Gathering. But Magic the Gathering is a European fantasy inspired strategy tabletop game. So
Right.
At the end of the day, yes.
Supposedly, I don't know if this is true, but I think that Wizards of the Coast now owns the intellectual property to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes.
I could be wrong about that, and that's horrible. But because they're terrible now. Anyway, and the only other thing I wanted to add here before we sort of like dive deeper into it is that from my perspective, what makes any RPG is the cumulative aspect to it, the level building, the character building, the level grinding aspect to it. And I think for as you were sort of like sketching out, as you did very well, that the background to the tabletop RPG, that was sort of came to mind as like the real break from the wargaming of the pre-tabletop, the pre-RPG era. That as far as I understand, there was basically nothing where you were like kind of like building up a character or anything like that. That seems to be characteristic of the RPG in modern times as we know it. When I was about, I'm going to say I was about 11 or 12, I played a bit of Dungeons and Dragons. I had a friend that lived across the street from me. He was a couple years older, 1 or 2 years older than me, and we played it together. And he was always the dungeon master because he was older and he had kind of like he introduced me to it and stuff like that. But as you can imagine, with just like two guys playing it, one's the dungeon master and one's the player or whatever, it got like kind of old pretty fast, sort of thing. It's definitely the kind of thing that you have to play with a group of at least like 3, ideally probably about 6 guys. I would imagine it's probably pretty much the sweet spot. So I have like very little experience with actually playing tabletop RPGs, but for some reason I don't know why, after I kind of like fell off playing Dungeons and Dragons and it kind of got old for me, I continued to like do world building and like those like hexagonal grids that they would have for like building those. I would like get these like hexagonal grid papers and just like make up worlds, you know what I mean? Like just like just building. For some reason, the geography was actually a huge part of it for me. I loved like making up different like land formations and like mountains and like coastline and everything and like cities and everything. And of course, when you're a kid, you like make up a little map or a little world or whatever, and like all the, especially like when you're a kid, like all the details sort of start to fill themselves in with like the whole world kind of like starts to come together and like become its own thing or whatever. And I just did this over and over for many years, even after I was playing D&D. So there's something about that. There's something in us as a people that just loves that world building, especially.
Yeah.
And then later on in high school, and a couple of years later, not that much later, I guess. I was in my first year of high school in 1994. So this was like, I don't know when Magic the Gathering came out exactly, but it would have been right around that time because I remember like this was a fairly new thing. And when I was in high school, I was like this kid that like straddled the line between like hanging with like cool people and also hanging with complete nerds. I was like I had a foot in both crowds. And I remember at my high school, there was this like 2-story flight of steps. And at the top of the steps, there was like, that was where all the kids would sort of like gather and just play Magic the Gathering. That was like this one little space where that would all happen and everything like that. And there's this one guy who like, he was like the biggest Magic the Gathering nerd like ever. And I remember this very vividly. Where he was like playing or something like that, and like they're laying their cards down, and it was just like guys were getting kind of rowdy, like shit was really getting pretty heavy. And he like leaned over, and all of a sudden this Hot Wheels car flew out of like the breast pocket of his shirt, and everybody just stopped for a second and like looked at each other, silence, and then he like he just like scrambled to grab this like Hot Wheels car and just like scurried off. And it was like everybody just like burst out laughing. And it was just like the most like, ridiculous. Like the guy was such a fucking nerd. And I remember like not that experience per se, but that's just sort of like, emblematic of the whole thing. Kind of like, the like super nerd aspect of it actually turned me off of Magic the Gathering for a while. And it wasn't until I was almost 30 or so that I like actually kind of gave it a shot. I had a friend who like, we'd go over to his place and like he was like a music producer as well, and so was I, and we'd like smoke weed, and he'd be like, him and his friends would be playing Magic and be like listening to like sludge metal, like Electric Wizard or something like that. And I was just like, all right, I'll bite, give me a deck and I'll see what I can do with it, kind of thing. And then I slowly started to kind of get into it. And I never really got that heavy into it strictly because I didn't have the time. Right. But like, I absolutely see the appeal of this stuff, like it appeals to my sort of like sensibility of like, I'm kind of like a half analytical, half creative type.
Yeah.
That was a perfect like, move for me to go into audio engineering because it's got both sides of the coin, kind of thing. And anyway, yeah, I can absolutely see that. So like the analytical side of the coin, the like very, very rational and like procedural kind of thinking goes along very, very well with tabletop RPGs and these like, card RPGs like Magic the Gathering and everything like that. So it's very clear to me why this appeals to like people like us.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I've always played these games and I never like really brought it out and talked, because there is a stigma. Like you mentioned, there is a subset of people that are so nerdy and weird that you just don't even want to be associated with. Like if you went to a Magic the Gathering tournament, probably like half of them are going to be people you don't want to hang out with, right? They're like fat guys with their butt cracks hanging out of their sweatpants, greasy ponytail. It's those are kind of, and then also you have the other half, or the good guy you were talking about that you played with in your as you got older. That was kind of like what me and my buddies were. That was metalheads, guys that like to drink, and guys that probably use psychedelics, and like the alt bros, you know what I mean?
Right.
That's
probably like the guys who are like the originals. I expect that's probably like what the people in the 70s who were playing it were.
Yeah, big time. That's who it appealed to. Guys that were listening to heavy metal, that like sports cars, guys that liked sword and sorcery, and
like Tolkien and stuff. Yeah,
the guys that are kind of like art bros, you know what I mean? Like kind of alternative, edgy art bros. It's kind of that was the original. That is kind of the primordial demographic of tabletop games, right? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just what's interesting to me is that like kind of coming back to it, because like I came back to it years ago when I met this group of guys that played Magic, and sort of coming back to it like to sort of prep for this episode here. I was like, it's very curious to me to like see how things have kind of changed, because that was many years ago that like I was playing Magic and got out of it like before I even left to move to Australia. That was like almost 10 years ago now. But to come back to it and to like sort of dive into like what is the culture like and everything. Of course, the culture for everything in terms of fandom and like nerd and geek culture and stuff like that has like in the past, I would say like 3 or 4 years maybe 5 years has just absolutely just become disgusting. It's horrible.
Yeah, it's
like
the worst.
It's so woke and stupid. Like, but it's interesting because I was thinking about this. Like, who does tabletop RPG? Who does this kind of thing appeal to? And I would say, on the one hand, it appeals to like autists, right? Like guys who are like technical people who probably do a technical job, like they're computer programmers or engineers or something like that. Somebody who does a technical job that can understand these things at that level. They're also people who appreciate and can grasp systems, right? And I think that this is part of why it doesn't appeal to Black people, like that guy was saying, is that like this is just not for them, right? Like it deals in abstraction to a degree that's like very, it attracts a certain type, to be honest. It also, I think, appeals to people who are very imaginative, right? Because, of course, there's an element of world building involved in it. You have to, there's no, like, you're not sitting down and like looking at like really sweet graphics, like, on a screen or anything like that. Everything's in your head, right?
Yeah.
Basically, all you're doing is talking and doing math. I mean, like, like, what kind of people does that appeal to? Obviously, it appeals to like autists and imaginative types. But it also appeals, and this is where it gets problematic, quote unquote problematic, is it appeals to people who are Eurocentric, who love especially the medieval aesthetics of, a certain period of time from roughly 500 to say 1200 AD. It appeals to people who love that aesthetic. And it's interesting because there's a kind of, there's a real cognitive dissonance in the culture of like gaming and especially tabletop RPG gaming, where these people love that aesthetic, and some people like love it and are also, conservative. But like, there's some people who are very, very liberal but love that aesthetic. You can kind of feel the cognitive dissonance there. It also, I think, appeals to guys who are a very low time preference, and this is another important part that sort of like makes it hard. Like, no matter how hard, like it gets sort of astroturfed as a kind of like, woke thing or like activist thing. Like there's like socialist, tabletop RPG forums and stuff on the internet. But like for the most part, people who are into those kind of political philosophies are at least the ones who are like into it, but like not, super into it, tend to have pretty high time preference. And that doesn't actually jive very well with tabletop RPG playing, because there's no immediate payoff, right? You got to get a thick rule book of like 700 pages, and you've got to get like, you've got to find people to play it with. And it's like, as soon as you start the game, it's like, it's do it yourself. It's like do it yourself entertainment almost. So it appeals to people with low time preference. And now the last thing that I found out about like the audience of tabletop RPGs is it actually appeals significantly to young people. Like apparently, according to Wizards of the Coast, like 40% of D&D players are 25 years old or less, which I actually found very unusual. I wouldn't have expected that, but I thought about that. I'm like, it's probably got something to do with the time commitment that's involved in it, right? Like, it's kind of hard for guys who are like 40 or 50 years old to find time to do that. So maybe that's part of why. But yeah, and it's an interesting kind of cohort of people that make up the tabletop RPG fan base.
Yeah. So there's a few things I wanted to touch on there. So like what I was saying earlier, I kind of didn't come out with it that I play these games. I was like, guys, we're talking about nationalism, we're talking about this. I didn't think anybody would like care, right? Or they would be like, you fucking nerd. I came out with it and I was like, I mentioned it or whatever. I found out that like every other guy in our spheres either plays some sort of tabletop thing. Like they do 40K, they do old school D&D, they do something, right? They play Magic. This is something that is like this kind of tabletop gaming is something that is very present among nationalists for some reason, right? Actually, it's not some reason. You actually outlined it fairly well. It's autistic, it's creative, and it's also very European. And in fact, you mentioned about kind of the demographic now that have effectively slithered in and taken control of the Wizards of the Coast game that they call D&D. And they've completely changed it. What is D&D now with the 5th edition and the stuff that they're creating is so far divorced from Gygax's vision. And in fact, they hate Gygax. They spurg like crazy about Gygax. They write endless articles about how is D&D ever going to be able to divorce itself from its racist foundation. And what they're talking about here is effectively the biodeterminism involved with making characters. Like if you're an elf, you get +1 to speed. If you are, they have racial attributes, and this is something that is a foundational part of Dungeons and Dragons that they hate. They hate it. They want to get rid of that. You mentioned about the time preference stuff. They have completely gotten rid of much of the stuff that has to do with building over time and like the long game. They want immediate payoff. They've made the rules so that the combat is easy. It has become this cream puff, gay, like it has just become nothing like original D&D.
That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, obviously it's retarded, but like it doesn't make sense to me on another level. Like, how can they get rid of the character classes or like the inherent attributes to these characters? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like it destroys like the framework and the structural framework of the game itself. The whole point. Any game has to have like a framework of rules beyond which, like, that are basically like unimpeachable, right? And so if it's anything like, certain attributes being like mutually exclusive or whatever, like if you got high constitution, then you will have low agility necessarily or whatever, I don't know. Maybe that's not it. But like anything like that is like, that's the meat and potatoes of the game, right? Like, how can they get rid of that without it just being like it's just basically like a choose your own adventure where you just like make shit up and like there's absolutely no structure to it at all. It sounds like that's kind of the direction it's gone.
They've eliminated the role in role playing and they've made it one size fits all, like complete just self-aggrandizing circle jerk. That's like literally what it is turned into. Original D&D is a strategy tabletop game. It is a game that it's nothing like what it like. If you go and you look up the supposed which I hate the term nerd and geek. I hate fandom. This stuff is for facts. I can't stand this shit. It makes me want to puke because to me, when I think of Dungeons and Dragons and I play old school Gygaxian Dungeons and Dragons, it was like. You get there with your buddies. It's a strategy game. It's not like this. Everybody's character has these backstories in this novella, and you play out this. No, you are in this dungeon. You have to try to survive. You try to win by getting all the gold or defeating the big boss monster at the end. It's like how we all understand a video game, but on tabletop and more advanced. It's literally it's for smart people. It's not for dumb people. And they've made it for dumb people that just want to live in some gay fantasy land. It makes me crazy. This is like my most hated thing. Like I get so mad about what they've done to this beautiful thing. And they have completely rejected, as I mentioned, they have completely rejected Gygax. They've canceled his son, driven him out of the industry. Wizards of the Coast is completely paused. Don't give a single dime to Wizards of the Coast now. They literally fund groomer projects. They literally send they was for Pride Month last year or whatever, for fucking whatever. They were sending money to this organization called the Lambert House, which was this house for LGBT youth, right?
Yeah, I've heard of this fucking thing.
And they were having drag queens come in, some of them with charges, right? With like child molester charges, like sex crimes, come in and hang out with these kids without their parents. That's part of the rules. Their parents aren't allowed to be there. It's supposed to be a safe space for LGBT, whatever. Wizards of the Coast is giving money to these people. Do not ever spend a dime with Wizards of the Coast. If you want to play tabletop games, and this is what happened in the 90s. It was like 1999 or 98 when Wizards of the Coast acquired Dungeons and Dragons. All of the old TSR stuff, the Gygax stuff, got they weren't able to secure the copyrights for it, so that went to public domain, and that started what was called the Old School Renaissance, OSR. and that has created kind of this break off of all of these kind of like retro clones and like I don't know where I have a book that I bought. I like to support these things. I think they're cool. There's all of these different. A lot of them are recreations of old school D&D, and some of them are completely new. I have one that's called Astonishing Sorcerers and Swordsmen of Hyperborea, which is a completely like nutty, Lovecraftian, Howardian pulp setting. There's just like so many cool RPGs that are out there. A lot of our guys have released RPGs. One of the most popular ones was a guy, I can't remember his name, but he created one that was called Axe. It's a Adventurer, Conqueror, King system. And this is one that's really well received because it's very much in the vein and in the spirit of Gygaxian style of play. I just shared one of our guys just released one that's all about pirates, a tabletop game about pirates. Tabletop gaming in its old school form is something that is very present and popular among nationalists because one, it's very trad and organic and it's in person. It has to do with European culture and history. It's math, it's strategy, it's long form thinking and all of this stuff, preparation. It's wholesome and it's fun and it's for intelligent people. And what it is now is just a complete fucking abomination.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a lot has changed sort of like in recent years and over probably over about 20 years really. But it's very interesting the attempt to cancel Gary Gygax and to like erase the sort of like the deeper history of the genre. I mean, this is not something that's restricted to tabletop RPGs or even like RPGs in general. I mean, like, there's also there's a much more minor controversy with the composer of the original Dragon Quest music, who's like a serious music composer, but also has some very, very, very problematic views, on gender relations and things like that. But you see this as well in literature, of course. They try to cancel Shakespeare. They've been trying to do away with him for a long time now. Because, well, for lots of reasons, actually. Because, number one, he was basically a traditionalist monarchist with, like, some very mild, like, Catholic kind of, like, sensibilities. And that's just not okay, Like, this is... Yeah. This is something that must be canceled sort of, a priori. And the other reason is that he's hard to read for these people because they're not smart. And, that doesn't mean that anything that's hard to read, that anything that's good has to be hard to read. It's just that Shakespeare is, and he's worth the effort, and not everything is. But these people they can't do it. They just can't do it. And that makes them feel small. Right,
it's not inclusive, is what they say.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the same thing with Homer as well. Homer's way worse because, of course, his he basically is the sort of sentiments and beliefs system of a archaic Greek of 1200 BC, which is totally alien. Like, it could not be any more alien to like the modern worldview of academics in modern universities. So anyway, this is just to say that these things have also been canceled, or they're trying to be canceled, but it's impossible. It's impossible to cancel the classics because, to use your term, they have foreverness and they will never go away. They'll always be in the background at the very least. They'll always have the influence will be always perceptible in what's current. Anything that's good, that's current. But more than that, they're just superior. They're just better than a lot of what's, especially the stuff that's pushed from the top down these days. But yeah, it's interesting that they're attempting to get rid of Gary Gygax. I'm sure they never will. But also, it's very interesting the notion of trying to do away with the aspect of tabletop RPGs that are, leaning towards racial essentialism. And what's interesting about that is that doing away with this racial essentialism means, of course, doing away with character classes in any meaningful sense, which means, of course, doing away with the game itself in any meaningful sense, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because, like, if certain, like I was saying, if certain attributes are kind of like mutually exclusive with each other, like this is kind of the basic framework of the game. But it's at the same time, it also, like, it carries a kind of moral lesson, like that's very much sort of like under the surface, but it's still there, still perceptible, and still something that you internalize, which is that something is just so, and that you can't change it, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, and this sort of like goes into, there's a saying that I didn't hear it until I was much older, until I was like in my 20s. But man, I wish I had heard this and internalized it when I was about 17 or 18. And that is, you can do anything, but you can't do everything, right?
Mhm.
The philosophy that you can have it all, baby. Like you can fart around in high school, and then you can graduate, and you can go and you can live the dream and chase your dreams, and try and be everything that that Hollywood tells you that you can be. You could be a rock star, or you can be this and that. You can chase your dreams, and then when you've had your fun, you're about 35 or whatever, you can start thinking about maybe getting serious and meeting someone and having a family. And this is how people's lives get ruined, right? This is I won't go on a big tangent about that because it's only tangential to the tabletop RPG thing, but sort of in the background here, as you're playing these RPGs, and as you're sort of like internalizing the idea that a character class is something that's fixed, and that you can, if you do one thing, like if you have a character that's like a cleric or whatever, that they also can't be a warrior, and so on and so forth. This is the kind of like lesson that like does get internalized by kids. These like 40% of tabletop players that are under 25, they learn this stuff, they internalize this stuff, and that this is something that's actually anathema to a lot of what the powers that be stand for. So yeah, it's very interesting to see them trying desperately to kind of erase this, to erase the brute facticity that these games impart to you, but in so doing, that they basically destroy the games themselves. And it seems like they're willing to do that, which is very sad.
Yeah, pretty much everything about the modern uh, creations of tabletop games is designed to just destroy the game. It like I mentioned earlier, what has the D&D brand on it today is not the original thing, and everything that they've done has effectively been to liberalize the structure of the game itself. For example, in original Dungeons and Dragons, in the first few issues, and pretty much every good role playing game, you don't get to pick and choose your stats. You get your stats, right? You have your strength and your dexterity, et cetera, and you roll your dice and you fill them out uh, down the line. And whatever you have, then you have to pick what class you can be, because there's certain stat requirements. And what this simulates is effectively you being born with what you have. You know what I mean? You are kind of at the mercy of nature and at the mercy of your genetics is what this simulates. So they have completely gotten rid of that. You're now allowed to put your stats wherever you want. There's no stat requirements for class. Anybody can be anything. And they've completely got rid of that because they know inherently that is biological determinism. That is, you are at the mercy of nature, at the mercy of your ancestry. And this idea clicked for me because I saw some libtoad fucking he had posted a video. I think it was either on Twitter or TikTok. I just saw it briefly. He literally threw it. The caption was cleansing the fash from the fandom, or whatever he said, from the hobby. And he took an original copy of the Gygax setting, Birthright, and hucked it into a fire. First of all, these original copies of Birthright are worth a fair, collectors like to pay a lot of money because it's pretty rare. It's a really cool setting, and I found that really interesting because Birthright is literally about being born with noble blood, having serfs, building a kingdom. It's literally a simulation of resource management about becoming and being a lord and becoming a king eventually. So this individual translated that as fascism, right? So he had to burn it and cleanse it, even though it was part of the original vision. It's one of the original settings of Dungeons and Dragons. So these people, they have cleansed every element of this game and completely destroyed it and made it into something that has contoured to their presuppositions and their sensibilities of liberalism, of liberal humanism.
Yeah, no, it's sad actually. It's sad to see because these people kind of have some healthy instincts, such as that. They're into these games, which means that there's probably some redeeming qualities to them. They're probably at least have that they're at least somewhat conscientious and so on and so forth. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any appeal. But there's clearly something broken in there as well in them. Yeah. And there's certainly parts of the game. There's certainly structural aspects to the game that are inherently problematic. Doesn't matter how you tinker with the system. It doesn't matter how much you eliminate things. Doesn't matter how inclusive it is. The fact is that as an example, I've already given the biological essentialism one that you can't really get rid of without destroying the mechanics of the game. Another one would be that it imparts the values of leadership and followership. And this is something that guys like that really hate because they have a chip on their shoulder because nobody's ever wanted them to lead anything in their lives because they're kind of weird and there's something wrong with them, right? But as the way that the game works, there has to be a dungeon master and there has to be people who are playing. And of course, the dungeon master, it's sort of like if you take a turn as the dungeon master, it teaches you get thrown into this because it demands such a creative ability, and it also demands a conscientiousness to learn the rules of the game, to kind of know them by heart in some sense. You have to, as the dungeon master, you have to learn how to lead an expedition, right? You have to learn how to create a scenario at the very least that that's gonna hold people's interest, right? So you're kind of the boss, right? And the players have to learn how to subordinate their own will to yours as the dungeon master, because you call the shots, you're the one that's in charge, you're the world builder, and they're along for the ride. The players have to kind of submerge their will into someone else's will. And this is exactly the thing that's anathema to people who are anti-fascist, because, like I say, they've got a chip on their shoulder because nobody ever gave a shit about what they had to say, right? So it's anathema to these people because they're necessarily just in the structure of the game itself, mechanics aside, just like the way that the game works at the most basic level is hierarchical. There's a leader and then there's followers, and that's very difficult for these people to swallow.
In fact, they've been changing the rules so that the dungeon master is now kind of beholden to what the players want. They've pretty much, not only have they have changed the rules to kind of overthrow the dungeon master, they don't even want to call him dungeon master anymore because master is problematic. This is how crazy and how much they have subverted and undermined the original vision. But to kind of get off of how much the leftoids and the facts and the freakazoids have destroyed the game, the old school game is still intact. There's lots of indie third party stuff that is very, very cool. Written, so a lot of it, not a lot of it, but there's a good portion of games and content out there that are written by our guys, right? It's something that, if you're listening to this, I know that probably a decent portion of you play tabletop games. So this is something that is, and if you haven't, it is a really wholesome, fun pastime for our guys to play. The way that I started, I got introduced to it by my older brother, who was really big into it. He taught me with the very early editions. I didn't play any of the later editions until I got older, but I started with the old school stuff. I started playing old school way, and this was a lot of fun for me and my friends because we lived in a very rural area, and we didn't have places to go. We didn't have playgrounds and basketball courts and places to go hang out. It was, if you wanted to hang where I grew up, where if you wanted to hang out with your buddies, you had to ride your bike a mile up and down a bunch of hills and through the woods and everything to go hang out with your buddies. It was intense to go hang out with your buddies. You had to put in work to go socialize. And during the winter time, you weren't going anywhere. I lived in rural Pennsylvania. We had some pretty gnarly snowstorms. When it snowed, if you didn't have an ATV or you didn't have a snowmobile, you were stuck. There was no school. There was nothing. So me and my buddies, if it was about to snow, we would all get together and we would hang out and we would get snowed in together and we would play these games. And it was a hugely wholesome thing for us because growing up as a white working class guy in an area that's pretty impoverished, an area where most I don't think any of my friends had both their parents married. We're all kids of divorce. We're all kids of poverty. We're all working class white trash kids, right? So for us, getting together and playing Dungeons and Dragons on the weekends kept us out of trouble. It really tightened the bonds of our friendship. It introduced us into so much stuff. It made reading and math and European history and folklore very cool. And not only did it make it cool and romanticized it, but it allowed us to interact with it and become part of it. And this is why I'm such a huge advocate for tabletop role-playing games. Because yes, as all of the things that we mentioned, it teaches hierarchy, it teaches leadership and fellowship, it teaches reading and writing and arithmetic, it teaches philosophy. Gary Gygax was a big guy into philosophy. You can go and if you read the early stuff, he's going into like Aristotelian virtue ethics. He's going into, which we in these spheres we could nitpick but for like a regular normie to go and like even hear about Aristotle or hear about Plato or hear about Nietzsche or like any of these guys is like a big deal. It's introducing these big brain ideas and all of this stuff together in a very unapologetically hierarchical European game that you could sit down with your buddies and strategize and use your creativity. There's art. It shows you literature. It's just like all of everything that we love combined together that you can play and interact with in a very organic, holistic, social format with no screens and no technology, with dice, paper, and pencils, and your buddies and your imaginations. And that it was such an important part of my life growing up, and it kept us out of so much trouble, and it was just a very wholesome, awesome experience. So that's why I advocate for it, because I think that we can take back this tradition and this fertile breeding ground because Dungeons and Dragons, whether we realize it or not, is a huge pop culture phenomenon. It is something that completely shook the ground and shaped pop culture as we know it today. Movies, games, everything, right? So for us to just abandon it and leave it go and like just hand it off, they're very based and brilliant guys like Gygax and Dave Arneson and all these people to like leave their visions and their creations behind and give them to literal mutants and demons. It's just ridiculous to me.
Yeah, no, definitely. I before we kind of like start drawing this, I guess, to a close or whatever, and I want to end on a very positive note. I want to bring in something that I thought of that might be just retarded that I thought of, and I'm not sure if it like makes any sense or whatever. But it's a kind of like reason, a possible reason beyond just the top-down sort of like cultural revolution that's making tabletop RPGs into like the travesty that it's becoming. There might be a sort of like deeper reason as well that it attracts people like socialists, or in some cases, because I've even read of like Marxists being into it and everything like that. And I don't know, I'm spitballing here, but I was thinking to myself that it's possible that the idea of systems as being definitive of reality might sort of play itself into a kind of a more socialist type thinking or a Marxist type thinking. I'm not saying, obviously, I'm not saying that like tabletop RPGs are going to turn you into a Marxist or that they're inherently socialist or anything. There's so many more reasons that they have, you know, a healthy influence. But the idea that the system itself is kind of definitive of the reality, it creates a frame within which reality is constrained. This is in some sense could be construed as a kind of Marxian view of the world, right? As in the game mechanics define the range of possible outcomes. If you take this idea too far, if you sort of like extend it autistically into like, you know, crazy territory, it can lead to something like Marx's dialectical materialism. And in Marxian terms, what this is that the base defines the superstructure. By base, what's meant is the kind of like material conditions that the material conditions basically dictate things like religion or law or like all these other sort of like more cultural things. Is basically that that materialism is upstream of culture kind of thing, and it's very much bound up with a sort of like systematic view of the world. Marxism is maybe, apart from Hegelianism, maybe the systematic, the system building kind of philosophy par excellence. And this might be a sort of like structural feature that lends itself towards somewhat of like left-wing thinking, right? It could explain why, in some sense, D&D, it could explain why it's so terribly allergic to what it calls Nazism, right? Or fascism, right? Beyond that, just D&D, it typically appeals to nerds, and that nerds get beat up by right-wing chads or whatever. That there might be something to this. So I don't know, like, just tell me if I'm a retard, but like, do you think that has any plausibility at all?
I would actually disagree with that because kind of the rats that have come in and changed everything. Why would they come in and try to change the whole system if they were attracted by the system?
I don't know why they're there in the first place, other than the fact that, like, you know, that they've been put there, right? Like that, like, you know, they've been marketed to specifically to attract them. But yeah, I don't know.
It's like we were talking about with heavy metal. Heavy metal is inherently a right wing thing. You know, everything about heavy metal is, you know, but for some reason these worms, they slither in and they destroy it. I think they just, anything that they see that has you know, that is made by based white dudes, that has like based white dude identity, they are attracted to it, and they for the reason that they want to destroy it. I don't think that it has I don't think that they really like heavy metal because they've changed it, right? They've changed it and made it into something else. I don't think that they actually like tabletop RPGs or wargaming. I think they wanted to come in and change it and force it into becoming their new you know, force it to adhere to the new world religion. This is what these people do. They do it with everything. Everything that is good, they do it. So I don't think that they're actually attracted to it, because if they were, they would have preserved some of it, which they don't. You know? At least that's my opinion on it.
Well, one of the things that makes tabletop RPGs so incredibly so good, you know, for this, and so resilient towards it, I think, is, again, some of the structural features of it. Anybody can write a tabletop RPG. Obviously, it takes a lot of time and energy and effort, but it doesn't take a video game development studio to make one. It takes one guy with commitment and you know, the conscientiousness, you know, to build that system and to make it internally coherent, so that the game mechanics actually work together and is good, right? Like, it's a good game, but it can be done by one person, right? There's low barriers to entry. If you can do good artwork, or you and your buddy, like, if you're the sort of like system builder guy and your buddy is the, like, you know, visual artist, you can make a tabletop RPG.
Yes.
So it doesn't require this enormous amount of capital to do, which means that there's lots of opportunities, there's lots of alternatives, there's lots of points of entry for based guys to get involved in creating this stuff, not just playing, but creating it. And another thing that makes it good is the beauty of it is that the old shit doesn't age, right? Like you can still play the second edition of Dungeons and Dragons and it's perfectly playable, right? It's not like there's graphics that have aged or the sounds all like 8-bit, like beeps and boops, and some people hate that. Nothing like that. It's just as good as it was back then, right? So it's there's something that kind of the old stuff can stand up to the new stuff, and I think this is part of what irks people about that, like the woke crowd that's kind of infested everything. Part of the reason why they're so animated and about this is that they're competing with an inherently superior product, and they don't have any technical advances that are basically sort of like make it so that there's like eye candy that they can put on there that is just sort of a shortcut basically to like appealing to people today. The old stuff is just as appealing, so I think that's really great, and it's beautiful that this stuff inherently encourages and introduces people to things, as you were mentioning before, like our traditional mythos and the aesthetic of like the medieval aesthetic and everything like that. But also, as you were saying before about Gary Gygax, introducing ideas from people like Nietzsche and stuff like that. Maybe perhaps the will to power or whatever. Don't underestimate how radical something like that is to somebody who has never heard of it before. When I was a teenager, I still remember like discovering Nietzsche when I was about 15 years old. Now, I obviously didn't read him because there's just no way for me to digest that in any way. But I just knew that he had a funny name with a whole bunch of consonants in a row. And I was like, he's the guy that's about slave morality. Just that phrase, slave morality. It's just like you hear it and you're like, if you're a kid that doesn't know anything about philosophy, but you know what morality is, and you hear slave morality, it's just like, whoa. That is like, it's just so outside of anything liberal or like, touchy-feely, whatever, the kind of shit that you'd be learning in school. You just hear that phrase and you're like, okay, this is like scary. You know what I mean? And that's the beginning of something. That's how you discover. That's the first step down the rabbit hole to something else. So for a lot of people, that might be something like D&D. These old school D&D editions and everything like that still have that sort of purist attitude and some of those aesthetics and the beliefs and the worldview that is just completely based. So that is, it's problematic, and that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. And also I would say, even if maybe you're a little bit older and you got kids, you don't really have time to try to invest in something like this. If you're an appreciator of Western art forms, just go check it out. Just go like maybe find a PDF or something, go look at some of the art. Some of the art very early on was very primitive. It was just like hand sketched by guys that aren't really artists. And it was like, you could just see how raw and homegrown it was in the beginning. And then later on, they got really, really tremendous artists. So they got guys like a guy named Larry Elmore, Clyde Caldwell. These guys were world-class illustrators and artists. And it is a flavor of art, a style of art that is very much in line with a Boris Vallejo or a Frank Frazetta. Obviously, it's different, but and then in there, and these guys were pretty based themselves. So they beautiful women, muscular heroes, powerful gods, and fearsome dragons. It's so European. The art is so cool and beautiful, and it's just cool to go look at, right? So if you are an appreciator of culture, Western culture, at least go take a look at it, and not just D&D, but there's a bunch of other games too. You have Rifts, you have Palladium, You have I mentioned before the first cyberpunk games. You had Shadowrun. You had there was so many out during this time period. So the art is cool. There's the concepts of the creative concepts that guys were creating to make their mechanics. If you're somebody that's interested in mechanics and these kinds of mathematical abstractions, go look at it. Just take a look and see how these things were working. And by the way, I created a tabletop game. I have a tabletop game I'm working on. So I think that it's imperative for those of us that enjoy this type of thing to go check it out. Maybe if you have kids that are starting a little bit older, introduce them into something like old school Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop games, because it was certainly for me and my friends, which we had like a crew of like 12 dudes that would get together every weekend and play. Every single Friday night after school, we'd get together and we would play. We would go out and run amok, and then we would come home at night, and instead of going out and partying and doing drugs and stuff and we did some of that, right? Everybody does. But we loved playing D&D. That was like our favorite thing. And it introduced me into a lot of literature and a lot of history and a lot of stuff that I would have never even heard of if it wasn't for it. So it's a wholesome, positive, awesome thing, in my opinion.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to land at the end of this episode. So this is cool, man. Actually, it's kind of whet my appetite. As we're talking here, I'm just thinking to myself, man, maybe I should go and like actually grab one of these like old editions of Dungeons and Dragons or something. Check it out.
You can get them for free online. You can find them online. Yeah,
exactly. And there's a low barrier to entry for you right there. So that's awesome, man. No, I'm glad that we talked about this, and this is something that, even though I can't speak from experience, I think that I would love to see guys get more into it, because basically any of the guys in our sphere that are into tabletop RPGs, I like these people. Anybody that like talks about it turns out that they're good guys. So there's probably something to that. So we're going to wind this up. Thank you guys. If you're listening at this stage of the broadcast, you are a subscriber. So thank you very much. As I mentioned before, you guys are the lifeblood of the organization. You keep the lights on. You keep everything moving. And I know we haven't had a release in a while, but we've got one coming out very, very soon. We're going to have original poetry from our sphere. I'm very excited about this book that's going to be coming out early September. I won't tell you the name of it. I won't tell you the author yet, but look for that. It's going to be really, really good. And if you want to check out what Dave is up to, go to thebizarchives.com. And there is so much that he's just put out recently. It's hard to keep up with, and it's great to see that your release schedule is intensifying. That's amazing. So thanks again, guys, and we will see you next time.